If you want to learn how to do this, stay tuned to find out how. What's poppin', and welcome back to another episode of Fletcher the Fisherman. Y'all have requested more than anything to see on the channel how to skip a bait cast or how to skip a fishing lure in general, and that is exactly what I plan on doing today. But before we jump into all the goodies, I want to go over the few categories that we're actually going to need to cover in order to be able to skip a fishing lure as efficiently and as easy as possible, and that is going to be rods, reels, line, lure selection, and technique itself, all of which are super important to be able to skip like a boss. So let's go ahead and jump right into our rod selection. So for the most part, I try to stick with rods somewhere between the length of 6'10" and like a 7'4". You can go shorter, you can go longer, you can definitely skip with a shorter and longer rod, but that middle range, that 6'10" to that 7'4" range, is kind of that sweet spot, because the shorter the rod you have, the more accurate cast you can make, but the longer rod you have, the more power you can put behind that cast, the more power you can put behind your hook set. So you don't want to go too long where you lose accuracy and have a really hard time skipping, and you don't want to go too short because you don't want to lose that power, that hook set ability, and that casting ability. So somewhere in between that 6'10" and that 7'4" range is ideal. The next thing that I want to cover when it comes to rods is the power of the rod. So you're either going to want a heavy or a medium heavy powered rod, and that goes back to needing that power to set that hook, because anything that you're going to be skipping is going to be probably a wide gap hook, because you just can't skip any lures with treble hooks where you want that moderate action or you want that medium power in a rod to be able to handle those treble hooks better. So you're going to really need a stout rod to be able to set that hook. So either a medium heavy or a heavy power rod is what you're going to want. Then the last thing that we actually need to talk about when it comes to rods is either the taper or the action of the rod, both of which is the same thing, just called two different things. And if you don't know what that is, that means where does the rod start to bend? So for skip casting, you're going to want either a fast action or an extra fast action rod. Basically what that means is the rod is going to start to bend, and that top 25% of the rod, that's where the majority of that bend and that rod is. And the reason you want that is because imagine trying to cast with a pool noodle. Like, that's going to be something more similar to a moderate action, where you have a ton of flex, a ton of bend in that rod, where it's going to be hard to have any kind of structural integrity to make really tight, accurate casts. Like, can you imagine trying to cast with a pool noodle? It'd be all over the place. It's way too flimsy. So having that fast action tip gives you enough bend to load that bait back up and whip it as fast as you need to kind of get that speed and that momentum to get that bait moving in order for it to skip, but also have that structural integrity where it's not going to be a pool noodle and just be way too flimsy. A moderate action rod is more suited for treble hooks, and you're not going to be skipping anything with treble hooks because treble hooks won't allow you to skip, as we'll get into once we start talking about the lures. But that is basically all you need to know when it comes to rods. And so let's go ahead and put that down, and let's hop right into reels. So when it comes to reels, guys, I get two main questions. The first is, does price matter? And the second is, what kind of settings do I actually need to set the reel on in order to be able to skip a bait caster? So for the first question, price definitely does matter. I'm not going to sugarcoat it and say a $50 bait caster skips just as well as a $500 bait caster. That's just not true. Can both of them skip a bait? Yes. And are they both capable of skipping baits? Great. Yes. But there is definitely a difference between the two price points. It's just easier to learn and definitely be more consistent with an expensive bait caster, but I don't want that to discourage you from trying if you only have like a cheaper $50 or less bait caster, and that's totally okay, because that is exactly what I learned on, and I can skip just as well with that as I can a really expensive one. So don't let that discourage you. So for the second question, I definitely want to go ahead and start talking about the settings, because that's going to be the biggest difference maker when it comes to being able to actually skip a bait caster. And for a lot of y'all, what I'm going to recommend is tightening your reel up, because that's going to save you a lot of headache. What a lot of people get discouraged with when they start trying to learn to skip a bait caster is they'll try to skip it, they'll blow up their reel, and they'll have to take all the line off, or they're going to be picking out backlashes all day, and that's part of trying to learn it. I still backlash all the time when I'm skipping. It's just part of it. The pros do it, I do it. Doesn't matter how good you get at it, it still happens. But what you don't want to do is start having a huge blow up where you're not even able to pick out the backlash, and you kind of just lose all the line that's on there. And especially if you're using fluorocarbon, it gets expensive and you don't want that to happen. So what I recommend is just backing off on all your settings, just making sure everything's a little bit tighter than you normally would. So the general rule of thumb is, here, let me back it up right here, is that you want to set this thing, which is, let me show y'all really quick, the little spool tension knob, this little guy on the side. You want to take that for the bait that you have on there. So like right now I have this little 1/2 ounce swim bait, and you want to set it so you just want to crank it up. You want to set it so it'll just barely start to fall, like once you loosen it up. So see right there, now I can just click that thing and it'll just start falling nice and controlled. That's kind of where you want that to be set. And the more comfortable you get with skipping, the more comfortable you get with casting, you want that to be a little bit looser, and that's just something you're gonna have to learn over time. And the second thing is, all bait casters, they come this way, so I wouldn't even recommend touching them unless you have already. If you open up the side plate, there's gonna be a bunch of little dials in there, or little switches. You want half of them on and half of them off. And there's a whole, I mean, every reel is different. So some of them have 4, some of them have 6, some of them, I've even seen, I think, up to 8. So just put half on, half off. That's gonna be the simplest way to tell you how to do that. And they're all gonna look different. So I mean, I'm not gonna open up this reel because it's gonna be pretty self-explanatory once you do that. But if you have never opened it up, just know it's gonna be half and half. So don't even worry about it. And then if you have a nicer bait caster, you're probably gonna have some kind of extra dial here on the side, and that's gonna either be a magnetic brake or something similar to that. And I would just recommend cranking that all the way up. And the more comfortable you actually get doing that skipping motion, getting that bait to skip, start backing off of that. And for me personally, guys, I keep it about halfway, and I keep my spool tension knob over here. I keep it just like a little bit looser than being able to fall like nice and controlled. So mine will still kind of come off pretty quick, but that's just because I've been doing it a while and I have a lot of control of it. And the biggest thing, guys, when it comes to skipping and not backlashing or not having a big old bird's nest, is your thumb pressure, your control of the actual spool with your thumb. What you want to make sure you do, guys, is be in super control, be super just aware of how much pressure you're actually putting on the spool. The second you let up, when you start skipping it, if it smacks that water really hard on a bad cast, you want to set your thumb down as fast as you can and really just stop that spool from backlashing really bad. If you don't keep your thumb, you don't put your thumb down, it's going to just blow up in your hand, and you're going to have a bad day because you're going to lose all your line, and you're going to have to re-tie all that on there, all that good stuff, and you're just not going to want to have to deal with that. So make sure you have nice, smooth thumb control, and that's just going to come with practice, guys. There's no easy way about it. This is just one of those things that takes a lot of practice, takes a lot of time. I've taken hundreds of thousands of casts, and I still backlash times to time, and it's just the nature of fishing, guys. So that's basically all you need to know when it comes to settings, when it comes to skipping a bait caster. But one last thing that I want to just kind of mention as a quick good tip, just trying to avoid some headache if you're trying to learn, just going out there and practicing casting. Go ahead and take a nice long cast, about just a little bit longer than the actual cast you're trying to make or practice skipping, and go ahead and stop it, and then take a piece of electrical tape and put it on the spool, and that'll basically keep the rest of your line that's not even going to be needed for that cast nice and tight on your spool. So that'll keep it from bird's nesting, save you a lot of headache when you're trying to learn. So that's a great tip. But the last thing that I want to mention when it comes to reels, guys, start with the spinning rod. You don't have to worry about backlashes with the spinning rod, and that's a great advantage of this. So I highly recommend starting with the spinning rod if you have one. Just learn the actual motion of the technique, which I'll explain later in this video, with the spinning rod first, and you're gonna save yourself so much headache with backlashes and bird's nests and all that good stuff if you just start with the spinning rod. I promise you guys it'll go a long way, and I cannot emphasize that enough. Start with the spinning rod if you have one. So that is that. So let's go ahead and jump into line. Line is the next topic of discussion. So I want to go ahead and talk about what I use personally. So for most of the time, I'm going to be using fluorocarbon because that's just what the bait that I actually want to use needs. Like whether it's just fishing something on the bottom, like a jig or a little soft plastic or anything like that, I typically use fluorocarbon. That's what most people use, and I would highly recommend using somewhere between 15 and 20 pound fluorocarbon. One, because it doesn't backlash as easy, and two, because if you're going to be skipping into cover under a dock or in bushes, you're going to want to have that higher pound test so that if it is rubbing, if it is a big fish and you're going to have to pull it out of that cover, it's less likely to break. So if you're really going to be pitching into some thick stuff, I definitely recommend probably using like 20 pound fluoro, or if you're going to be using braid, if you're really getting into some thick stuff, use like 50 to 65 pound braid, and that's going to save you a lot of headache. But if you just want to learn and all you have is monofilament, that's a good option. It doesn't have as much memory as fluorocarbon, so it's going to be a little bit more forgiving when actually trying to learn to skip, and it's not as expensive. So if you are blowing up reels, it's going to be a little bit more forgiving to your wallet. So I mean, that's a great way to learn. But if you're actually going and using it for a fishing application, I recommend 15 to 20 pound fluoro or 50 to 65 pound braid, just depending on what you're actually fishing. So now that we're done with lines, let's talk about baits. As much as I would like to be able to skip every bait in my arsenal, it's just not possible. There's a bunch of baits that just aren't even capable of skipping, so if you tried it and blew up your reel, it's probably because you were using the wrong bait. So you can't skip anything with treble hooks. That's crankbaits, that's jerk baits, that's top water baits like walking baits, poppers, stuff like that. You just can't do it. Those treble hooks, they grab the water and they keep that bait from skipping. So don't even try it. Spinner baits, all that good stuff are not going to be capable of being skipped. So what I would recommend, my best recommendation for learning how to skip, this is by far the easiest bait for me to skip, and I know a lot of people can tell you the same thing, and that is a flat, emphasis on flat, a flat, smooth swim bait, just like this. A lot of swim baits you see will come like this, which are great and can still be skipped. They're just not as easy to. They have like these ribs on them, and those ribs just make it a little bit harder to skip. And just think about it. If you're going out and you're wanting to skip a stone, you're looking for the smoothest stone possible, and the same thing is with a fishing lure. So get a nice flat smooth swim bait, and that is going to be perfect. And I recommend either using a 1/2 ounce or a 3/4 ounce or somewhere in between, like a 5/8, and that's going to be a great place to start. So just a little 1/2 ounce jig head with a little swim bait, and that thing should skip like a dream. And I would stick away from trying to use a jig to start with like this, and if you are going to use a jig, make sure you're using one with like a nice flat head, and then like a beaver style soft plastic trailer. Just as much volume, as wide and flat as possible is going to make it easier to skip. But trying to skip a jig can be really just like, it can give you a headache. It's actually one of the harder baits to learn how to skip that's actually capable of being skipped, and so I would say stick away from the jigs as long as you can. But once you kind of mastered using some of the other baits, I definitely would go ahead and start learning how to use a jig. So start with that little 1/2 ounce paddle tail swim bait. Oh, if y'all are curious as to exactly which one this is the Berkeley Grass Pig, and you can use whatever color you want, just depending on your situations. And I want to go back to our last thing, and that's learning to skip a spinning rod. So I'd either do it with a little swim bait like that, or take a stick bait and rig it wacky style just like this, and that is a phenomenal way to learn how to skip a lure. So either a wacky rig on a spinner or a smooth swim bait on a bait caster. So now that we've got through all the boring stuff, it's time to get into the actual cast itself. How do you make this dang lure skip? So instead of going straight back like a normal side cast, you're actually going to want to roll cast, guys. And that's basically taking that rod tip and that bait and going in a circular motion. And if you've never casted like this, I recommend just practicing making long normal casts, like long normal roll cast first before you try to skip it. But if you already know how to roll cast, that's great. It's time to move on to the next step, and that is where do you actually pay attention to when you're trying to cast. And this is where a ton of people make a mistake. A lot of people, they try to look where they're actually trying to hit the water with the bait to start skipping it. And that's a huge mistake. What you want to do is stare at the actual target that you're trying to cast to, whether that's a specific pocket up underneath a bush, a specific spot up underneath a dock. You want to stare at that spot and keep your attention focused there. So once you have that figured out and once you have that mindset to where you need to actually focus your attention, it's time to make this thing actually skip. And the way that you're going to do that is get that thing as low and as fast as possible. You're actually going to need some momentum behind that bait to get it to skip from spot to spot to spot on the water. And if you just don't put enough oomph behind it, that thing is not going to skip for you. So you actually have to put a little bit of power behind that bait to get it to skip. But don't try to go like all out and skip it as hard as you can. That's just going to be a huge mess for you. So just kind of start slow and figure out where that kind of speed point is where it actually starts to skip for you, and just work up in speed from there. But when you cast, guys, you want that bait to hit the water as soon as possible. And if you take a look at this slow-mo version of me actually skipping a bait on the water, you notice that the bait only hits a few feet in front of me. And that's because you want to get that bait low as you can, because you don't want that bait to start skipping right at your target. You don't want a bait to start skipping the second it enters a bush, a second it gets up underneath a piece of cover or something like that, because that first skip is going to be the biggest skip, and you want that bait to actually start leveling out with the water and have nice, smooth, low skips as it comes into the target. So what you want to do is get that circular roll cast and have that bait come down nice and low, drop your shoulder if you have to, and get that bait as even to the water as possible so it just glides across it. And from there on out, it's all about reel control, all about thumbing that spool so the bird's nest doesn't just blow up in your hands. And it's just a feel thing, guys. You're gonna have to do this a lot to really get the feel of it, and this is why I go back to what I said earlier, is you want to start with a spinning rod, because you're going to be able to get that motion down first, be able to figure out what kind of angle and what kind of speed you need to throw that bait at to actually get that thing to skip, and you're going to be able to do that without having a ton of backlashes in the process. And one final tip for you guys, if you're trying to get that roll cast down, you're trying to get a really nice, tight, low roll cast that's going to be able to allow that thing to skip, try tucking your arm all the way up against your side. And like pretend like if you put like a dollar bill right here between your arm and your side, try to make sure it doesn't fall out. What you want to do is keep that thing nice and low. I mean, you can do it without doing it like that, but that's a great way to learn, because it forces you to be consistent with your casting motion, so you kind of do the same cast over and over again instead of having just like a variety of different arm lengths and all that stuff out here. But once you get that down, you can kind of get more comfortable kind of getting your body out there a little bit more and casting that way, especially if you're trying to like tuck around something that's in the way and you need to kind of get out there to get to it. But hopefully you guys enjoyed all these tips, and if you did, make sure you drop a like down below and subscribe if you aren't already. Thank you guys so much. I know this was a long one, but hopefully I included tips on everything that you need to know to be able to learn how to skip. And as always, bassin is a passion. Peace.